It's 2018, and the blazing sun hangs low in the sky over the Syrian desert. The location? The town of Khasham, pre-war population 7,000 in the Deir ez-Zor governorate. Khasham is a town on the front lines of Syria's brutal civil war, and in 2018, that war still rages with a fury unmatched anywhere else on the planet. To the north of Khasham are the Kurds, a Western-backed coalition of ethnic militias backed up by the United States of America. To the south are the forces of the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, backed up by a feared, but back then obscure mercenary organization called the Wagner Group. Neither side understands fully what the night ahead will bring, but as sunset turns twilight, and twilight is replaced by the cold and quiet of the desert night, all hell is about to break loose. The battle that ensues will go down as history as the first time a military force of Americans and a military force of Russians had fought each other directly since the Cold War. In the aftermath, dozens will lay dead, perhaps even hundreds, in a shocking first taste of a future that today we know all too well.
Ever find yourself itching for a game that's a bit more explosive, a little something to satisfy your inner history buff and your need for action-packed chaos? Well, that's where War Thunder comes in, and they're today's sponsor. So, what is War Thunder? Well, imagine taking command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 different nations spanning almost 100 years of military history. We're talking everything from World War II era biplanes to modern-day fighter jets. And the best part? It's free to play on PC and consoles. My personal favorite feature is X-ray damage view. The level of detail is incredible. It doesn't just show you where a shot hits, it breaks down why your vehicle got destroyed. You can see the fuel tank explode, the engine go up in flames. It's a little bit gruesome, but it's great realism. Plus, whether you're a casual gamer or a simulation nerd, War Thunder's got something for everyone. Arcade mode for quick action, simulator if you're looking for something a bit more hardcore. And best of all, you can play it for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. Just make sure to use my link in the video description or the pinned comment below when you sign up. If you haven't created an account or played in 6 months, you'll get a massive bonus pack to kickstart your journey. It includes 3 premium vehicles, 50% experience and income booster, 2 advanced vehicles for rent, the exclusive Eagle of Valor decorator, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account time. It's a lot, and it's available for a limited time only. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring, and now back to today's video.
This is the Battle of Konoko Fields, better known today as the Battle of Khasham. By 2018, the Syrian civil war had long since evolved from a nationwide revolt against a repressive regime to a melting pot of competing insurgencies, competing ideologies, and competing foreign powers trying to turn the situation to their favor. Foreign involvement had really picked up in 2014, when the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, better known as ISIS, had rapidly swallowed up territory and made global headlines for its unmatched brutality. But although a United States-led Western coalition had arrived with the primary focus of combating ISIS while working with their local Kurdish allies, the reality hadn't been so simple. Russia was backing the ruling regime, ostensibly also to counter ISIS, but taking a broad approach and punishing any faction that stood against the Assads, while the United States had found pro-government militias and even Syrian army troops in its crosshairs more than just a few times. By late 2017, the United States had shifted its focus away from counter-ISIS operations. The group was still a threat, but it had been pushed out of most of the territory it controlled and was now on the run, with American and Kurdish forces poised to begin cleanup operations in the areas where ISIS still had influence. With the jihadists routed, the US pivoted toward longer-term goals, and specifically the prospect of starting negotiations with the Assad regime toward an end to the conflict. In hopes that those negotiations would take place on favorable terms for the United States, American forces began to take a more active role in countering local militias backed by Iran and granting support to the Kurds in locking down their territory and protecting their newly autonomous zone in the northeast. Although the situation would change significantly within the following 2 years, America's intent at the time was to transform its military presence in Syria into an open-ended affair, with the expectation that they would stick around as long as was necessary for the Assad regime to agree to a peace. But on the regime side of the conflict, the Assad family and their political allies were in far less of a compromising position than the United States may have hoped. Although they were far from establishing control over the whole of their country, something they still haven't actually achieved even today, they had neutralized or found stalemate against any threat large enough to challenge their rule in Damascus, and they had worked to a diplomatic position where Assad himself could be assured that Western attempts to effect regime change would never get worldwide support. Assad had powerful allies, Iran just 2 borders distant to the east, and Russia lending direct military support, not just through airstrikes and military advisors, but through a mercenary organization that would carry out Moscow's will to the letter. Now, at the time of writing, 2024, we're all too familiar with the private military company, or PMC, known as the Wagner Group. Over the past few years, they've enacted exceptional violence on the people of Ukraine, they've used thousands of convicted prisoners in expendable human wave attacks, and they've attempted and been thoroughly punished for a mutiny that risked bringing all of Moscow to its knees. But back in those days, Wagner was a relatively new organization, born out of Russia's low-grade war with Ukraine in the eastern Donbass long before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. These were still the days when breathless exposé reports in Western media on these mysterious Russian mercenaries with their funny name were relegated to the back pages of news sites for the true nerds of global affairs. In Syria, the group had picked up valuable experience and taken hard losses fighting against the Islamic State and anybody else Moscow pointed them toward. By the end of 2017, their focus had shifted toward oil and gas assets in Syria, probably because of a suspected policy change in Moscow that established that private companies that could seize oil wells, gas assets, or mines from the Islamic State would be entitled to the rights to extract those very same resources. By then, a suspected 5,000 or more Wagner fighters were in Syria, working for both the Russian Ministry of Defense and powerful companies that promised them a share of the profits from oil fields they captured. Their ISIS Hunters unit, in particular, gained local notoriety, fighting alongside and incorporating Syrians to their ranks as they attempted to eviscerate the economic core of the short-lived caliphate. By February of 2018, Wagner and their Syrian allies were steamrolling ISIS forces across the countryside and coming right up to the conflict lines with US-backed Kurdish forces. They were separated by the Euphrates River, with Syrian regime forces and Wagner forming a hammer against ISIS and driving them into the anvil that was autonomous Kurdistan on the opposite shore. Both sides had an understanding that the Americans and the Russians were to keep to opposite sides of the river, along with the local forces they supported. But Russia and Syria appeared intent on pushing that boundary, flying their planes over the conflict line, harassing American warplanes, and sometimes dropping bombs on places where closely allied forces and even American advisors were believed to be present. That wasn't just simple bullying either. It appeared to be an attempt to find out whether America really believed its own assertions that it would defend the Kurdish forces it was supporting. And for Wagner and the Assad regime, that was a particularly important question to answer. Kurdish forces had come into possession of some very lucrative gas and oil fields. Syria wanted them back, and reportedly, Wagner was offered a 25% share of the revenues for any fields they helped secure. But the Americans weren't giving their adversaries the reactions they needed in order to calculate the risk involved with seizing targets past the Euphrates. In order to get that information, it looked like Syria and Wagner would have to attack directly, and if their goal was to provoke and measure an American response, then attacking an easy target simply didn't make sense. They'd have to attack someplace where the Americans had a presence to see if they'd stand and fight or abandon their Kurdish allies once the situation became more difficult than they had signed up for. The ideal target was located just outside of Khasham, where the company Conoco harvested natural gas from a vast field and processed it in a refinery there that had the capacity to churn through 450 tons of the stuff every day. It was among one of the most lucrative single targets in all of Syria, and if the Americans weren't going to defend that, then they probably wouldn't defend anything. As the sun rose on the morning of February the 7th, the American forces in Khasham already knew that something was coming. They'd seen a troop build-up over the course of the prior week, and we in the public domain have learned after the fact that intercepted Wagner chatter suggested that an as-yet unclear attack was coming. Per unnamed US intelligence sources interviewed by the Washington Post, America had a pretty clear understanding that the goal was a lightning attack of some sort. But how that assault would work was substantially less clear, and there was no way to find out until the attack began. Prior to the battle, the United States had maintained a small but significant outpost within the Conoco refinery. The troops there weren't numerous, but they were among the very best at America's disposal, a roughly 30-man contingent made up of operators from some of Uncle Sam's most elite fighting forces. Within the refinery were members of the US Army Rangers, the shock troop regiment that the United States uses when it's looking for shock and awe takeovers and full frontal assaults. Beside them were members of the US Army Special Forces, or Green Berets, experienced soldiers who carry out unconventional warfare operations, leading and training foreign insurgencies, carrying out direct raids and assaults in unexpected places, and operating far behind enemy lines. They were backed up by members of the Screaming Eagles, the 101st Airborne Division, an elite air assault division that's used to fighting well behind enemy lines with little to no support. Also among the operators in Khasham were members of Delta Force, arguably the most capable known asset in the entire United States military, experts in carrying out the most dangerous and complex secret missions that the US Department of Defense can cook up. Stationed in Khasham was at least one Air Force combat controller, elite fighters who can keep pace with Delta, the Rangers, and the Green Berets while directing airstrikes. We know that combat controller was there, by the way, because even though their name has never been revealed, they'd be awarded their branch's highest honor, the Air Force Cross, for their actions during the battle. Also in close proximity was a base belonging to the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, the Kurdish coalition that the US was so closely partnered with in the area. About 20 miles away, another small US force lay in wait, a so-called quick reaction force made up of 10 Green Berets who were ready to offer support if needed. A Marine infantry platoon was also on hand in the event that the battle spiraled out of control and lasted long enough for the Marines to mobilize and join in on the fight. But the force they were facing down was a hell of a lot bigger and more threatening. Not far from the refinery, some 500 or so ground troops had massed in a formation comprised predominantly of Wagner Group mercenaries, but also including members of the Syrian Army's 4th Armored Division and 2 pro-government militias, the Bakir Brigade, hailing from the Syrian city of Aleppo, and the National Defense Forces, a part-time unit made up of volunteers from a range of Syrian cities and towns. Even compared to both the troops at the Khasham outpost and the quick reaction force nearby, the Wagner mercenaries and the Syrians outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1, and they had a hell of a lot more firepower on the ground. The Wagner-led force had a total of 27 vehicles at its disposal, including multiple Soviet-era T-72 main battle tanks, multiple T-55 tanks, and several armored personnel carriers. They had at least 6 artillery pieces, including howitzers and heavy artillery tubes, probably accompanied by a small arsenal of infantry mortars. Also at their disposal was at least one twin-barrel Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun, taken by Wagner forces and modified so that it could shoot level with the ground and take out hard-to-crack targets. That gun could fire up to 33 rounds per second, and it's unclear whether Wagner forces had only one at their disposal. At about 3 o'clock in the afternoon that day, the Wagner and Syrian forces began creeping toward Khasham. Like many Wagner and Russian forces in assaults past, this group claimed to the Americans that it was taking part in a training exercise, but nobody on the ground was fooled by that nonsense. Quoting a Green Beret who spoke to American outlet The War Horse in 2023, I think part of the tell was that Russian doctrine says that they're going to do these things that look like exercises right up into the point. The Americans and the Kurds near their position understood that these were no training exercises and that an attack was coming within hours. The only question was where and when. At about 10 o'clock in the evening local time, not at the Konoko plants, but right at the American outpost itself, the United States got its answer. The Battle of Khasham began with an encirclement as the column of tanks and armored vehicles under Wagner's control broke out from cover behind a neighborhood and took positions around the outpost. For half an hour, the standoff held before all hell broke loose. The US outpost came under a barrage of tank, mortar, and artillery fire, and the American operators inside quickly took cover, moving under fire to defensive positions where anti-tank missiles and machine guns had been prepared in advance. For 15 minutes, US operators held their fire as their commanding officers tried to reach Russian leaders and demand that they call off their attack. A lone MQ-9 Reaper drone in the skies above launched its Hellfire missiles, causing some damage, but not nearly enough to make the Russians back down. After that, the Americans on the ground fired warning shots, taking every last preventative measure to stave off what would become the first direct ground battle between nuclear-armed America and nuclear-armed Russia in generations. The drone above kept on circling, beaming back video of the assault despite lacking any means to directly intervene. But as the American operators on base were holding out, other US forces were surging into action. The Rapid Reaction Force of Green Berets nearby, as well as several Marines from the platoon they were stationed with, had already loaded their mine-resistant vehicles with the missile supplies and optical gear they'd need, and were now speeding at breakneck pace through a war zone to get there. They were followed by a handful of Kurdish fighters in unarmored trucks, but not nearly enough to make a difference. Driving without headlights and relying on thermal optics to dodge down power lines and craters, the reaction force were going into a firefight where they'd be exposed and outmatched. As defense writer Alex Hollins put it in 2023 in an article, quoting him, "It's important to recognize that they knew full well that they could only offer bodies and ammunition. They didn't have nearly enough firepower to balance the scales of the fight, let alone tip them in their favor. Without additional support, they were willingly driving into an American bloodbath, intent on helping their brothers in arms, even if it came at the cost of their own lives." But they weren't alone. In the skies, the cavalry was already on the way, comprising a who's who of American air assets that had been dispatched from all across the Middle East. Among their number were F-22 stealth fighters, F-15E Strike Eagle planes for ground attack runs, heavy B-52 bombers, formidable Ghost Rider gunships, and Apache attack helicopters, all equipped with the sorts of firepower that Wagner on the ground just simply couldn't match. At this point in the battle, Wagner and their Syrian allies still hadn't advanced to take the US outpost, kept at bay by the operators holding a perimeter. It's unclear whether the troops on the ground realized that an American air wing might be on the way to deal with them, but they had neither the preparation nor the military hardware to be able to defend against the overflights that were on the way. Perhaps back in Wagner's command center and far away in the Kremlin, that was irrelevant. After all, these were mercenaries, not Russian troops, and Russia had little reason to care if they were wiped out. The goal wasn't simply to take the Konoko plant. The goal was to see how willing the Americans were to defend it, and these 500-odd fighters might have been seen inside the Russian Ministry of Defense as a blank canvas for the Americans to paint out a response protocol that the Russians could study. But whatever the reason, the assaulting force hadn't taken over when the warplanes arrived, and they had little means to fight back once it did. The ground force of Green Berets and Marines arrived about 30 minutes after the Americans at the outpost had started firing back, and roughly an hour and a half after the confrontation had begun. When they got there, they were forced to wait, knowing all too well that the intense fire pouring in on the American outpost was too dangerous for even their armored trucks to pass through. The Kurdish fighters who had joined them chose to turn back, following a decision by a leader who one member of the reaction force would describe Riley in later interviews as, quote, "smartest man on the battlefield." Pinned down, not far off from the thresholds where ammunition would become too scarce to answer fire directly, the 30-some American commandos at the outpost were weathering heavy artillery and tank fire. Mercifully, none had died or been wounded yet, but with time running out, they'd soon have to switch gears and make ready for the ground assault they knew would come after their base had been adequately tenderized. Eventually, the response force worked out a way in, guided by infrared lasers with the help of the commandos in the compound, and they, along with the few Kurdish fighters who'd chosen to stay, took up defensive positions. Their armored trucks were lined up behind a defensive berm, pointing the machine gun turrets atop them toward the Russians, but that only drew the fire of the monstrous anti-aircraft gun, strafing that defensive position with almost 3 dozen 23mm rounds a second. A couple of probing infantry attacks were beaten back with inexperienced and reportedly undisciplined Wagner and Syrian troops chewed up by the fire coming back at them. But that sort of defense wouldn't hold in the event of an all-out assault that seemed sure to be coming next. A few minutes later, 10 Russian tanks began advancing together toward the outpost, likely signaling what would become the beginning of the end for the forces pinned down in their path. Then, the cavalry arrived, streaking in from overhead with afterburners roaring and onboard guns firing. The Air Force combat controller on the ground had been hard at work, marking targets and relaying information on proximity, position, and other targeting details as their situation got worse. With the advancing tanks now less than 1,000 meters away, the accounts of the American survivors make it abundantly clear what happened next. A rescue at the last possible second. 4 Apache helicopters were the first to arrive, and knowing the stakes of the moment, the operators on the ground began expending the last 50 caliber ammunition they had, illuminating the battlefield so the helicopter pilots could get a better shot. By the accounts of one operator after the fact, things might have gotten worse a few moments later. The operator, identified only as Andrew, attested that allies over the radio had advised their force of an incoming Russian bomber. But the bomber never arrived, perhaps owing to the very obvious F-15E fighters that could have brought it down, and perhaps owing to the F-22 stealth fighters accompanying them, fighters that the Russian bomber wouldn't have seen on radar, but that they very easily could have worked out were going to be arriving. And once the American air power showed up, the tide was turned in a way that the Wagnerites and the Syrians stood no chance of getting back. Leaked Wagner audio after the fact described the Apache attack in colorful terms as, quoting here, a f***ing merry-go-rounds with heavy caliber machine guns. And if that was bad, then precision-guided air-to-ground missiles were worse. The rest was elementary. A bombing run from an American B-52 and crippling destructive fire from a Ghost Rider gunship circling overhead. Within 45 minutes of the arrival of the Apache helicopters, the battle was over, with the attacking mercenaries and militia laid to waste. Those who survived were forced to flee, although they'd come back throughout the night, far less confrontational in their approach to collect their dead. By the time the sun finally rose again over the oil fields of Khasham, the Americans were firmly in control. As American forces took stock of their situation at the battle's end, they discovered what we, at least in the public domain, understand to be something of a miracle. Per official reports and witness accounts of the battle, not a single American on the ground had been killed or even injured, despite what seems to have been an incredible expenditure of ordnance by their adversaries. One fighter from the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish coalition, had sustained minor injuries, and some of the Americans had taken the sort of damage that would leave them sore for a few days, but against all odds, that was the worst of it. All that, and it's even more impressive because, at least by American accounts, the tank assault and possible bomber run that might have occurred if US air power didn't show up would have probably killed everybody there. On the opposing side, the Wagner and Syrian forces were not so lucky. Casualty figures on that side are tough to pin down, with estimates ranging from 55 dead on the low end to about 300 on the high. Syria claims 55 killed. Russia officially claims 80 to 100. The United States claims between 100 and 200, and intercepted audio from Wagner fighters who were present suggest losses potentially well north of that 200 estimate. The vehicles the Russians had brought with them suffered just as badly. Per a Wagner fighter, who can be overheard in leaked audio recorded after the fact, quote, "Out of all vehicles, only one tank survived and one BDRM. That's an armored vehicle. After the attack, all other BDRMs and tanks were destroyed in the first minutes of the fight right away." Going by American accounts, the first minutes of the fight that the Wagner commando referenced were most likely the first minutes after air support began showing up, since their arrival apparently took place only after Russian tanks began their final advance. Said the same Wagner mercenary, quote, "Well, to make it short, we've had our kicked." The lone surviving tank, by the way, would be destroyed a few days later. The immediate aftermath of the battle would grant the United States and the rest of the world a window into just what it meant to face Wagner troops in combat. Russia would hardly acknowledge the battle in the aftermath and made only minimal attempts to explain the deaths of Russians in the incident, all the while firmly denying that any members of the Russian armed forces had been involved. Even during the battle, Russia had given the United States no information about what was going on, had completely refused to help draw down the fight, and had refused to claim the Wagner fighters as a component of the Russian military. We now know, in hindsight, that that was precisely the point of Russia using Wagner at all, hiding their intentions behind a mercenary force whose actions and whose lives they didn't have to take responsibility for. Wagner has served similar roles all across Africa and the Middle East, not to mention Ukraine, and although they haven't suffered a similarly massive defeat outside of Ukraine until all the way in 2024, Russia's handling of casualty reports has been consistent no matter how many Wagnerites die. And by some accounts, Russia's abandonment of the Wagner contingent began well before the dust had even settled in Khasham. American sources have suggested that Russia's Ministry of Defense may have chosen to abort its support for the Wagner column midway through the battle, allegedly powering down the mobile surface-to-air missile system that was providing coverage from aerial attack. It's unclear why that would have happened, but if, indeed, Russia's intent all along has been to assess whether the US would defend the oil and gas infrastructure Russia wanted, then by that point in the battle, perhaps Moscow had its answer. Perhaps it was better in the minds of the Russian MOD to abandon the Wagner fighters and let American air power wipe out all traces of their misadventure. It was only after the air defense system was shut down that American aircraft had been cleared to come in, and once they did, the battle was all but decided. Again, we today have the benefit of hindsight, and we know that the idea of Wagner fighters being expendable to Russia is no surprise. But back then it was new and critical information for a world still trying to figure out who they were and what they did. If the Battle of Khasham had gone differently, if American troops had executed a tactical withdrawal and surrendered the Konoko gas fields to Syrian forces, then it likely would have been just the beginning. If the Americans would give up Khasham, then Russia would have every reason to assume that they'd give up all the other oil and gas fields that were less important than Khasham. After that might have come larger offensives into Kurdish territory and seizure of assets that would have handed major wealth back to the Syrian regime. Instead, Wagner forces tried the same thing in Diaz or a couple of weeks later, and this time, when US officials called Russia to explain how such a confrontation would go, Russia listened. Today, the Euphrates River still divides Syria between the Kurds and the regime, and all the natural resources behind the Euphrates are still firmly in Kurdish hands. American forces haven't gone toe-to-toe with Wagner in the same way since the Battle of Khasham, and nor have they had to face troops that Russia does lay claim to. Instead, those battles are decided mostly in Ukraine, at least for now. But as the United States and the nations of NATO make ready for a gruesome prospect, a possible all-out defense of the alliance's eastern flank, the Battle of Khasham provides the only basis we've got to map out what such a defense could one day become.
And that's a wrap for today's video, but before you click away, don't forget to check out our fantastic sponsor, War Thunder. If you haven't created an account or played in 6 months, you'll get a massive bonus pack to kickstart your journey. It includes 3 premium vehicles, 50% experience, and income booster. It's a lot, and it's available for a limited time only. There is a link to them in the description below. Play for free, and thanks for watching.